I'm Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society at Columbia and Barnard. And the center was founded 2 years ago, a little bit after the LinkX Center at the École Polytechnique, which is headed by Frederick Breckenmacher. And so he and I got together and very wonderfully have been supported in organizing this series of talks alternating between Columbia and Paris over the last few months in September. The last one was November in Paris. It was, I hear, a great success. Professor Sam Roberts from the History Department at Columbia gave a talk on racism and public health and had some wonderful respondents from Paris institutions. So tonight it's the Center for Science and Society and Columbia and Barnard's turn, and we have wonderful speakers and respondents here. But before we start, I just want to welcome you and to give the floor to Christina Lutzig, who is going to say a few words about the whole collaboration.
It's a very great pleasure for me to welcome you and to present École Polytechnique here on the occasion of the third lecture organized in the frame of Alliance program, and which is part of Science, Technology and Society discussion series that was launched by the president of École Polytechnique in New York this September. So the discussion series featuring scholars from École Polytechnique and Columbia University take place in New York and in September throughout the academic year. These series are organized by the Columbia University Center for Science and Society that Pamela just represented, and the links, École Polytechnique Research Laboratory in the Humanities and Science and Social Sciences. The discussion series enhance the existing links between École Polytechnique and Columbia University. And this collaboration is in the frame of Alliance program meets the strategy of development of École Polytechnique. And our collaboration is focused on visiting professors with the support of Alliance. Columbia is actually the first university with which we set up a faculties exchange program on the international scale. Innovation and entrepreneurship, which is actually in the very heart of École Polytechnique's activity nowadays. We, as you maybe know, École Polytechnique has opened the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center that hosts startups and entrepreneurship projects this year. And so École Polytechnique is very open to collaborate with its partners worldwide, and notably with Columbia University. Was the first partner in the world with which we set up a program based on this field. This is a students' initiative, so we're very proud of it. And it was initiated by CORE, the organization, the Students' Association in Columbia University. And the third field, environment and sustainable development. IX and Columbia signed the exchange program for graduate students between the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in Columbia University and École Polytechnique to facilitate the graduate students' mobility and scientific exchange. And so I'm here today to represent École Polytechnique and, of course, to thank the Embassy of France in the United States for its support, Barnard College for hosting this event, Columbia University for its collaboration and for all the beautiful projects that are actual now, and of course the Alliance program for its collaboration and for its very great help in the organization of this discussion series. And now I would like to give the floor to Mina Pham, Counselor for Science and Technology at the Embassy of France in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So my name is Mina Pham, and as it has been said, I'm the Counselor for Science and Technology at the French Embassy located in Washington, D.C. But it's my pleasure to be here today at Columbia in my capacity of Scientific Counselor. And I would like to thank Alicia Lefebvre, who introduced me to the Alliance program. I have to say that I didn't hear much about it before we met. And this program between Columbia and French universities and Grande École like École Polytechnique and the Paris one is really a success story, I think. And this gave me the opportunity to, Alicia gave me the opportunity to support this series of lectures at the interface between science and society. So I'm especially pleased to attend today's lecture about climate and the Anthropocene, which is organized between École Polytechnique and Columbia University, since our Office for Science and Technology was deeply involved into the preparation of COP21, which was held in Paris, I think you all remember, and we organized a series of conversations between French and American scientists, entrepreneurs, stakeholders, about various aspects of climate change impacts, such as on health, agriculture, water availability, extreme events, etc. So nearly 20 meetings of that kind were held throughout 2014 and 2015 in the frame of a program called FACTS, Facts for French-American Climate Talks. This year, to ensure the follow-up of the COP21, we're dealing with the impact of climate change on oceans.
It's an impact.
Extreme event. And this program is now called FACTS-O for French-American Climate Talks on Oceans. And I, as well as my deputy, Pierre Michel, would be happy to discuss these issues later. So now I'm very keen to hear about Jean-Baptiste Fressot's work. He's a researcher at CNRS, which is my former home institution. And I know that CNRS is a multidisciplinary French research organization where research on climate change is conducted with various approaches from physics, mathematical modelization to social science and humanities. So I'm sure that we will learn a lot tonight about climate change and our role as human beings. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this invitation. I'm very much honored. With or without the capital letter commonly attributed to geological epochs, the word Anthropocene has and will have its place in scientific journals, in dictionaries, in newspapers, and even in the history of environmental sciences. Given the fact that it already circulates widely in the informal markets of ideas, far beyond the academic world, in the arts, the media, and even in political struggles. In short, given that the word Anthropocene is already out there, why its formal recognition by stratigraphy seems so important? Why are we anxiously waiting for the decision of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, a venerable scientific body, but nevertheless quite obscure? The main reason is that the Anthropocene concept is not a scientific discovery. It does not refer to recent advance in our understanding of the functioning of the Earth system. Although staggering, spectacular, or grandiloquent, its strength is not conceptual. It is mainly and primarily symbolic and aesthetic. The concept of Anthropocene is a brilliant way to rename and summarize some fundamental results of the Earth's science. It captures the idea that the processes that humanity has triggered have such inertia that the Earth is living the climate regime that prevailed during the Holocene, the last 10,000 years. Unlike the expression environmental crisis, which designates a brief ordeal whose outcome is imminent, the Anthropocene refers to a point of no return. It is a geological bifurcation in the history of the planet Earth, without any foreseeable return to the normal of the Holocene state. The strength of the Anthropocene lies precisely in this extraordinary encounter between human history and the history of the Earth. 2 centuries of human activity at most were enough to cause an alteration comparable to the great upheaval at the end of the Mesozoic era 65 million years ago. This is why the Anthropocene has such an evocative power. What we're experiencing is not just an environmental crisis, but a man-made geological revolution. So the Anthropocene derives its aesthetic power from its geological pedigree. And paradoxically, the decision of stratigraphers is all the more important for the Anthropocene that we generally do not care much about stratigraphy. in the general public, including scientists, stratigraphy has the reputation of a somewhat dusty, serious, and boring discipline. Stratigraphy, removed from the turmoil of international climate negotiation, the IPCC and the COPs, stratigraphy seems to grant to the environmental issues the seriousness and the gravity of a supposedly neutral science. The Anthropocene, in a way, is a way to cool down the global environmental alert, to separate it from the turpitudes of the young and dynamic Earth sciences and bring it back into the realm of a more venerable science. In a way, the success of the Anthropocene reflects our nostalgia and our longing for a non-politicized science, as if science could be disconnected from the real world and the problems that run through it. But for political ecology, the concept of the Anthropocene is not without problems and shortcomings. One of them is to revive a very peculiar kind of aesthetic, the aesthetic of the sublime, a Western and bourgeois aesthetic, which had been vilified by Marxists, feminists, subalternists, and postmoderns alike. Indeed, the Anthropocene discourse follows closely enough the canons of the sublime as defined by Edmund Burke in 1757. According to this conservative English philosopher, best known for its absolute rejection of the French Revolution, the experience of the sublime is associated with the feelings of astonishment and terror. The sublime is based on our own insignificance against a distant and vast nature suddenly manifesting its omnipotence. Let us now listen to the main scientists who have promoted the concept of the Anthropocene. The human imprint on the global environment has now become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system. Humankind has become a geological force in its own right. So more precisely, the Anthropocene transfers the sublime of the powerful nature to humankind. While playing the effect of the sublime, it reverses its traditional polarities. The overwhelming and sacred terror of nature is transferred to humanity, now understood as a geological superman. But this aesthetic operation, though very successful, is very problematic, because what is made sublime is not humankind, but it is in fact, and of course, capitalism. The Anthropocene is certainly not the consequence of the human species taken as an undifferentiated whole. If one looks at CO2 historical emission statistics, it seems that the anthropos of the Anthropocene has a strong English or American accent. I mean, if you look at cumulative emissions in 1900s, just the emissions of CO2 and the emission of CO2 of just Britain and the US is like 65%. In 1950, it's around 55%. And one has to wait the late 1970s to see the total emission from the rest of the world to overpass the emissions of just US and Britain. And it is even worse than that, because of course, those countries being major financial powers, they project the carbonated capitalism onto the rest of the world. In 1914, for instance, Britain owned 50% of foreign direct investment, and the first sector in which it is invested are railroads, and then it is mining companies. And in the late 19th century, you got more than 1,000 mining companies all over the world that are traded at the London Stock Exchange. The word Anthropocene has also a very strong Malthusian flavor. It is the human species as the main driver. But in fact, the Anthropocene is not a matter of population growth. Between 1800 and 2000, the human population has increased by a factor 7, the consumption of energy by a factor 50, and capital, if we take the figures of Thomas Piketty, by a factor of 134. If, as Frederick Jameson put it, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism, this is because capitalism has become coextensive with the earth. What brought us into the Anthropocene is above all a vast technostructure oriented towards profit, a second nature made of roads, mines, plantations, oil wells, pipelines, power plants, container ships, banks, etc., which organize and structure the flow of matter across the globe in a very unequal way. Let us consider the so-called Great Acceleration of the 1950s. This staggering economic growth in Western capitalist countries was made possible by the colossal extraction of materials from the peripheral regions of the world system. The material trade balance, that is the trade balance not expressed in dollars but in tons, shows the extraordinary metabolism of Western industrial countries, draining materials and energy from the entire planet. And by the way, there is an interesting, I think, comment to be made on this graph. It is that when you consider material trade balance, it appears that the main ecological difference between the capitalist and communist system is that the communist camp exploited and degraded its own environment, whereas the Western countries had the capacity, the unique capacity, to fuel their growth on the gigantic appropriation of mineral and renewable resources from the rest of the world. So the first problem of the Anthropocene aesthetics is that it transfers the natural sublime to capitalism, whose strength is now measured not only in GDP and in profits, but in comparison with the events of the first nature, the volcanoes, the plate tectonics, or the variation of planetary orbit, the very kind of events that 2 centuries of Western aesthetics taught us to fear, but also to revere. The second aesthetic resource of the Anthropocene is the sublime of the scientific discovery. Let us listen again to the promoters of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, as it becomes more well-known, I quote, in the general public, could well drive a similar reaction to that which Darwin elicited. So this is a quote from an important article by Will Steffen, Jacques Greenwald, and Paul Cruden in the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society. And this official story of the Anthropocene as a full-fledged scientific revolution on par with Darwinism is actually is rehearsed by the press. The media is very keen on reporting such a story of paradigm shift. The Economist refers to the coining of the word Anthropocene as, I quote, one of those moments when a scientific discovery could radically change our vision of things, as when Copernicus understood that the Earth moved around the sun. Philosophers have been quick in seizing the Anthropocene as a new historical condition in want of theory. Before, we separated nature and society, we reduced the Earth to a stage. Now, the Earth's Gaia has entered the stage, as to quote Bruno Latour. And that is why the Anthropocene baffles social theorists, philosophers, and artists. It seemed to designate an interesting metaphysical event, the advent of a reflexive planetary body. The purpose of my talk today is to infuse a little bit of modesty in this Anthropocenic revelation. Of course, my point is not to say that there is no change, or even to say that the continuities are stronger than the change. But rather to question the reason of staging such a revolution between a blind past and an enlightened present. By doing so, the goal is to undermine the comforting illusion of our own exceptional Anthropocenic awareness. So to do that today, I propose a tentative genealogy of the ontology of the Earth system. And my story starts on July 1494, during the second voyage of Christopher Columbus. While sailing between Cuba and Jamaica, his fleet was caught by the torrential summer rains of the tropics. The expedition was in peril, and in this critical situation, Columbus had the following reflection. The sky, the tendency of the air, and of the weather in these places are the same as in the area around, namely that every day at vespers, a cloud appears with rain that lasts an hour, sometimes more, sometimes less, and he, Christopher Columbus, attributed these to the great trees of this country. The proof that Columbus brought of a relationship between forest cover and rainfall is that he knew from experience, trovato per l'esperienza, the original is in Italian, that the same conditions had prevailed in the Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores, but that since the Spaniards and the Portuguese had cut the trees, which crowded ingombravano the islands, they generate less clouds and rains than before. I think this observation by Christopher Columbus should be taken extremely seriously. For Columbus, the climate of the Caribbean islands had a fundamental importance because he had to reassure his readers, Ferdinando and Isabella, and his bankers as well, about the habitability of the newly discovered territories, which were all located in the so-called torrid zone of the ancient geographers, a zone which was supposed to be deprived of life. Just before the episode of the tropical rains, Columbus described Jamaica in superlative terms as the most beautiful islands he had previously encountered, with extensive and convenient harbors, excellent shelters, and he compared its pleasant temperature as a night of May in Andalusia. But the experience of tropical rain, of course, contradicts this image of the Caribbean island as paradisiac space, offering unparalleled colonial opportunities. And it is at these key moments of the text that the possibility and even the certainty of climate change is invoked. What must be understood is that the exploitation of timber, very profitable in itself, would release the island of its forest clutter. It would transform the Caribbean climate because trees, as Columbus explained, generate clouds and rains. Columbus' strange idea that forests generate rain derived from its direct experience of the ecological impact of colonization of the Madeira archipelago. Madeira and Porto Santo, which were uninhabited before the Portuguese landed in 1419, experienced an extremely brutal environmental change. Madeira, the island of wood in Portuguese, became in a few decades the world capital of sugar production. In the 1450s European capital, Arabic technology and African slaves converged to make Madeira the first plantation economy in history. Sugar refining being energy intensive in 1500s, it is estimated that sugar refineries in Madeira consumed more than 1,000 acres of forest per year. As the Genoese merchants established in Lisbon in 1470, Columbus was perfectly acquainted with the sugar boom of the time. Even better, in 1478, he married Felipa Moniz, the daughter of the conquistador of Porto Santo himself, and after his marriage, he settled for a time at Porto Santo, which was under the government of his brother-in-law. So Columbus was in the perfect place to know about the environmental consequences of plantation economy and deforestation. A story circulating between conquistadors, traders, and scholars must have fed his thought on climate. It concerns La Isla de Hierro, the westernmost island of the Canary archipelago. This island symbolized at the time the end of the known world. Ptolemy, in his geography, had chosen this island as the meridian, and in his travel diary, Columbus expresses the westward distance from the position of Isla de Hierro. So it was the point zero of Spanish navigators and cosmographers, and the Isla de Hierro was also extremely famous for harboring at its peak a prodigious tree, a sacred tree, El Árbol Santo, a tree that had the property of attracting the clouds and condensing them into rain. This unique tree would have provided water to all the inhabitants of the island and their livestock. Legend has it that several Spanish expeditions failed to conquer the island for want of water, while the inhabitants, originating from North Africa, knew a celestial source, a miraculous tree attracting the clouds and distilling them into rain. Columbus, who took food and water supplies in the Canaries, was most probably aware of this very famous prodigy. And it is from this story that he inferred the drying effect of deforestation. In the 16th century, the Canary Island constituted a compulsory stopover en route to America. And thus, the description of the holy tree becomes commonplace in chronicles of the New World. The prodigies reported by the Italian humanist Pietro Martire d'Anghiera, the inventor of the phrase New World, by Antonio Pigafetta, one of the 18 survivors of the Magellan's expedition, and last but not least by Bartolomé de las Casas, the famous defender of the Indians. Columbus' climate change theory also appears to have been generally accepted by the first Spanish settlers in America. According to Fernández de Oviedo, an extremely important colonial administrator, author of Historia Natural de las Indias, According to Fernández de Oviedo, writing from Santo Domingo in 1548, climate improvement was no longer a hope, but a proven fact. From his talks with both learned men and natives, he said that he had acquired the certainty that these lands, inhabited by Christians since 1492, are more temperate and cooler than before. And he adds, all Spaniards living there for some time agree with this observation, which is the subject of a lot of discussions. In the 16th century discourse about climate change, the issue is actually always related to issues of sovereignty. And the basis of climatic improvement, according to Oviedo, is political. The cooling of the Isla Hispaniola is due to the Spanish sovereignty, I quote, which tames and softens these regions. And climate change was, in fact, and of course, a providential argument in favor of the global reign of Charles V, of Carlos V. The fascination for the sacred tree extends well beyond the 16th century and well beyond the Spanish Empire. The Canaries, the fortunate island of Pliny the Elder, were considered to be the most extreme place of ancient geography, beyond the columns of Hercules, at the edge of the known world. In the Middle Ages, they play a cardinal role in European spiritual topography as the real or imaginary locus of paradise. Among scholars and Renaissance poets, the holy tree evoked the fountains of youth, the tree of knowledge, and thus this prodigy acquires an extraordinary visibility in the European Renaissance, in travel diaries, in botanical works, or in natural philosophy. In all these genres, references to the holy tree, the fountain tree, l'arbre santo, l'arbre fontaine, l'arbre saint, the references to this sacred tree are absolutely innumerable. So, what is the link between the sacred tree and the Anthropocene, you might ask? Let us zoom on the beginning of CO2 emissions curve. In the late 18th century, deforestation was by far the main anthropogenic source of CO2. At the beginning of the Anthropocene, the main source of CO2 is deforestation. Depending on the model, it takes 1900s or perhaps even 1950 for fossil fuel emissions, coal and oil, to surpass emissions from deforestation. Now, the early Anthropocene, the period of the 18th and early 19th century, corresponds precisely to a time of an intense debate on the climatic consequences of deforestation. And it is the sacred tree, again, which played a crucial role in starting these reflections. To understand this, one must think in the framework of natural theology. Natural theology thought the earth as a divine creation, a perfect machine, in which the fluxes of matter connecting the earth, the atmosphere, and the oceans were perfectly balanced. In this natural theology of the earth, water was at the center because its perpetual circulation from the equator to the poles proved the existence of a divine plan ensuring the fertility of temperate regions. Local climates were already apprehended as a part of a global phenomenon depending on the flow of water across the globe. In the late 17th century, natural philosophers in England, such as John Ray, Robert Boyle, or John Evelyn, started to ask a very simple question. Could deforestation alter God's plan for the earth? And it is the sacred tree which served as a small-scale model of deforestation-induced climate change. For John Evelyn, an important member of the Royal Society and an early promoter of rational forestry in England, deforestation was not only threatening the Caribbean plantations, but even fertile and rainy England was threatened by drought and climate change. The interest in the water cycle, coupled with the sacred tree narrative, revived the Renaissance organismic metaphors of the earth. According to John Ray, without the mountains and the trees, the earth would be uninhabitable, as the vapors emanating from the oceans would not condense into rain. And just after mentioning the sacred tree, in the water cycle, Ray concludes, some philosophers think that the earth is a large animal. If this doctrine were true, we have, I believe, discovered the circulation of its blood. The question that haunted the intellectuals of the time was not, of course, climate change, but to know whether humans' actions were sanctified by God. And for English natural philosophers, very often closely involved with the imperial project, one pressing issue was to know whether or not colonization was part of God's plan. In his Cosmical Suspicions, Robert Boyle, the founder of the Royal Society, one of the founders of the Royal Society, reports that he witnessed an interview between the King and John Winthrop, the governor of New England, and Charles II inquired whether or not America's climate was warming thanks to the English presence. Again, climate change in Britain, just as in Spain, was understood as a sign of sanctification for the imperial project. At the end of the 18th century, this imperial optimism was turned upside down. The reasons for this change are complex. I will just mention two of them. The first one is a major energy crisis. In France, the price of food doubled in the 1780s. Memoirs about forest conservation proliferated, and some made a connection between the impending energy crisis and the state of the earth. For instance, in 1784, a memoir about the efficiency of fire, in a memoir about the efficiency of fireplace, an author proposed a fantastic graphic description of the general equilibrium of the planet threatened by deforestation. I mean, the idea is that if you cut the rope, the whole planet could be destabilized by the rupture of the providential cycle of water. The second reason of climate catastrophism is the issue of national forests. In France, in 1789, the forests from the clergy were nationalized. And this huge forest asset, absolutely unique in Western Europe, served as a collateral for various financial operations, for backing the assignats, for instance, the ill-fated paper money of the revolution. In 1815, after Waterloo, the French government proposed to sell national forests so as to pay the war indemnities imposed by the Allies. And the ultra-royalists were, of course, absolutely shocked to see the ecclesiastical woods sold to pay for the debts caused by Napoleon. And this fostered a fierce debate in the National Assembly in which climate change was constantly invoked by prominent politicians, and in particular by Chateaubriand. I will make 5 remarks on the climate debate of the 1810s and 1820s. Of course, what was at stake is not the carbon cycle, but the water cycle. So, the feared climate change is not the same as our climate change in a way. But there are strong similarities. First of all, the stakes were already global. For instance, it was thought that deforestation in the United States and in Europe had increased the moisture in the atmosphere, and this moisture, this water, condensed at the pole, increasing the ice sheet and causing harsh winters in Europe. The issue was also scientifically equipped. With my colleague Fabien Locher, we have written a paper showing that it is precisely at this time that the basic methods of historical climatology were established. The study of glacial moraines, the dates of harvest, in particular grape harvest for wine, or the evolution of the scale of vegetation on mountains. Fourth, the issue of climate change was also taken up by key institutions of the time, the Académie des Sciences in France, the Royal Society in Britain, the Parliament, and the Ministry of Interior. And lastly, climate change was thought of as an irreversible phenomenon, questioning the very meaning of civilization. As by felling down forests, the climate change, this could well undermine the very condition for forest regrowth. And from the 1820s, a powerful discourse that one could describe as climatic Orientalism warned European governments against deforestation and climate change by invoking the ruins of brilliant civilizations now lying in the middle of deserts. And this engraving taken from a journal called Annales Européennes, which was devoted only to the question of deforestation and climate change, and published by François-Antoine Roche, an important French forester. This engraving is a kind of cautionary tale. I mean, this representation of Babylon, the ruins of Babylon, could well be the future of Paris or London if nothing was done to stop deforestation. During the 19th century, the idea of material cycle remained central. Thanks to the development of chemistry, the old concept of nature's economy was applied to an increasing number of material cycles. A chemical worldview emerged which conceived nature as an ensemble of material flows connecting all beings on Earth. According to chemists, the divine order could be read with clarity at the scale of atoms and molecules. The astronomical metaphor of the clockwork universe was transposed to the Earth, now understood as a vast chemical machine. And it is in this context that in 1845, the French chemist Jacques-Joseph Ebelman established the main principles of the global carbon cycle by identifying the geological processes tending to increase or decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. The atmosphere was, according to him, co-produced by the living beings. I quote, "Changes in the nature of the air were constantly and without doubt related to the nature of life in each period." And in 1855, Eugène Hussard, in what is probably one of the first, or perhaps the first technological catastrophist book ever written, entitled La fin du monde par la science, the end of the world through science, published in 1855 during an industrial exhibition that took place in Paris. So Eugène Hussard had this kind of prescient quote, "In 100 or 200 years, the world crisscrossed by railways and steamships, covered with factories and workshops, the world will emit billions of tons of carbonic acid, and since the forests will have been destroyed, this billion of carbonic acid may indeed disturb the harmony of the world." I will now conclude. I think historically one can really doubt that the Anthropocene represents a paradigm shift in the history of environmental thought. On the contrary, the idea of the Earth and the planet as a system whose equilibrium is threatened by human activities has a very long past. And this issue of novelty is not only historical. The problem with any prophetic narrative centered on a sudden awareness is that by obliterating the reflexivity of past societies, it tends to depoliticize the long history of environmental destruction. Of course, if our ancestors did not know what they were doing, we can absolve, in a way, their actions. And I think today the intellectual excitement around the Anthropocene reveals a rather idealistic view of the environmental crisis, as if awareness announced an imminent redemption. One of the pressing challenges for historians, a challenge posed by the Anthropocene, and especially for historians of science, is to refute the narrative of a blind humanity transforming the Earth unknowingly. We need to bear in mind that the destruction of the environment has occurred not as if nature counted for nothing. In the late 18th century, industrial pollution darkened the atmosphere in spite of neo-Hippocratic medicine, in spite of a medicine which was obsessed by the question of the quality of the environment. And in the early 19th century, in the same way, deforestation continued in spite of the fear of climate change. Later in the century, the use of natural resources intensified in spite of the awareness of their limits and the idea of nature economy. As I have argued in L'Apocalypse Joyeuse, the historical problem is to understand how modernity became disinhibited in its relation to nature. We need to take on board the disturbing fact that we entered the Anthropocene knowingly. The question is, how could we forget that we lived in the Anthropocene and pretend to discover it only lately? The experience of the sublime can only be understood in relation to a particular historical context. It relies on cultural, natural, and technological conditions, and it is these conditions that provide the key to understand its political meaning. In the 19th century, when the project of a technical mastery over nature was still taken seriously, the sublime of an almighty and uncontrollable nature provided a kind of guilty pleasure. In the early 2000s, the sublime of the Anthropocene provides a similar guilty pleasure. While the liberal intellectuals converted to environmental concerns, while they rejected the modernist ideals of nature control, as they proclaimed the end of grand narrative, the end of progress, the end of class struggle, etc., the Anthropocene provides the thrill of a new grand narrative, of a new grandiose horizon for political action. Compared to the rather dull program of sustainable development, theorizing the movement of humanity as a telluric force, as a geological agent, seems much more exciting than reflecting upon degrowth. But for political ecology, the sublime of the Anthropocene is problematic. It revives the technological hubris of the Cold Warriors, and it is significant that Paul Crutzen, the inventor of the Anthropocene, is also an advocate of geoengineering. It disconnects the local level to what really matters, the global and geological time scale. In short, it produces shock and awe, but little concrete actions. And finally, like any other kind of sublime, it is subjected to the law of diminishing return. Once the audience is prepared, its effect is blunted. The risk for political ecology is to be embarked in a permanent escalation of grandiose claims, as if only the grandiose was worth the effort. Before embracing the Anthropocene, we must remember that the sublime is one of the categories of aesthetics, which includes, of course, many others, the tragic, the beautiful, the picturesque, based on other feelings, sadness, harmony, love, modesty, that may be more able to feed an aesthetic of care, of small, of local, of self-control, which political ecology needs so much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask people to hold their questions actually until after the respondents. That was really a stimulating lecture. Thank you. We're going to have 3 respondents now. They're each going to basically raise questions for about 5 to 7 minutes, possibly less. And we'll start, I'll introduce them all now. Our first speaker is Professor Debbie Cohen. She's in the history departments at Barnard and Columbia, and she's one of the cluster leaders at the Center for Science and Society. Her research centers on the history of the physical and earth sciences and the cultural history of Central Europe. She's published 2 wonderful books, most recently The Earthquake Observers, Disaster Science from Lisbon to Richter, and previously Vienna in the Age of Uncertainty, Science, Liberalism, and Private Life. And her current book project is especially relevant to this lecture tonight, which is tentatively entitled Climate in Word and Image, Science and the Austrian Idea, which explores how climate came to be understood in terms of the exchange of energy among systems at a spectrum of scales from molecular to hemispheric. So she's really the perfect person to comment on this historical, this history of the Earth as a world system. And then our second speaker will be Frankie Pavia, who is a third-year graduate student, PhD student at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And he studies oceanography and uses naturally occurring radionuclides and noble gases to study the processes, oceanic and solid earth processes. Our last speaker will be Professor Adam Sobel, who is a professor of applied physics and applied mathematics and of earth and environmental sciences at Columbia. He studies atmospheric and climate dynamics, tropical meteorology, extreme weather, and he has published many, many articles on both modeling and empirical studies. He's the recipient of many awards and grants. Most recently, he received the American Geophysical Union Atmospheric Science Award in 2014. So please help me welcome all of the panelists, and Debbie Cohen will speak first. Yeah, you might as well come here.
So thank you so much, Jean-Baptiste, for coming here and giving us so much to think about. I'm very sympathetic, I want to say, to your critique of the aesthetics of the Anthropocene and your suggestion that an alternative aesthetics might be better able to inspire an ethos of care appropriate to the present crisis. What I want to focus on today, though, is this idea that we knowingly entered the Anthropocene. I want to talk about what it meant, what it could have meant to know, and particularly about the question of evidence. I mean, so it seems to me that the Anthropocene is about evidence more than anything else, about the evidence that will be visible to geologists of the future of the activities of humanity in the past. And the history that you've sketched of the relationship between deforestation and climate change is, I think we could agree, a history of ideas, of beliefs. And if we're going to attribute knowledge of anthropogenic climate change to past societies, I think we need to consider the evidence on which those beliefs rested and those societies' own standards of inference. So I'm curious to hear more about what you mean by these theories being scientifically equipped. What was the evidence? What was the degree of certainty attributed to it? In my own research, I find that these theories were highly uncertain, hotly debated. They were studied empirically, for instance, by means of experimental forestry stations, but the data produced was equivocal, as almost every expert acknowledged, and certainly they were far from able to quantify the local climatic impact of deforestation. Actually, this remains an unsolved question today. And as far as the evidence of a global impact, we have all the more reason to ask what kind of evidence that rested on, since 19th century researchers had no way to make global data, as in the words of the historian Paul Edwards, right? Since the necessary infrastructure wasn't in place until the 20th century. So under those conditions, it seems questionable for us as historians to say that anyone in the 19th century knew that deforestation caused climate change. And I worry that attributing such knowledge to people in the 19th century actually demeans the knowledge that climate scientists possess today. And then there's another dimension that I would like to see brought into this narrative, and that's the politics of forest protection in the 19th century. So today, it's surprising to learn that the advocates of forest protection in Europe included an authoritarian empire like that of Napoleon III in alliance with aristocratic landowners. And in fact, some historians argue that the timber shortage was really a fabrication of these powers to keep peasants off lands where they had been entitled in the past to collect wood and pursue other means of sustenance. So in this context, men of science faced a dilemma to advocate forest protection on the basis of shaky evidence or to allow rural populations a chance at economic development. And in fact, that dilemma is not so far from that faced by climate scientists in the 20th century who have to ask, or had to ask, how certain their predictions must be to justify restrictions that might inhibit economic opportunity among disadvantaged populations. So when exactly was that appropriate degree of certainty achieved? Because I believe it has been achieved, but as historians, that's a question for us. So my aim isn't to exonerate those who came before us, but to do justice to the complexity of the problem then and now. And to be able to say as precisely as possible the sense in which we knowingly entered the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much.
All right, so like Debbie, I'd like to thank Jean-Baptiste for providing a fascinating view of the history of humanity's knowledge of its effect on Earth's climate. I'd like to start my response from the statement that the experience of the sublime can only be understood in relation to a particular historical context. Burke's characterization of the sublime as being based on our own insignificance in the face of the power of nature can be considered, at least partially, a result of the incredible age of the Earth and the duration it's been dynamic and evolving in comparison to the age of human civilization. I was curious, as an Earth scientist, about what might be different if we were trying to characterize the Anthropocene from a similarly planetary perspective. So let's expand this analysis to a slightly wider geologic window of time, the Pleistocene epoch. Spanning the end of the warm Pliocene 2.6 million years ago until the onset of the Holocene, about 12,000 years ago, the Pleistocene is characterized climatologically and geologically by oscillating glacial periods, where massive ice sheets covered much of North America, and interglacial periods, which were relatively warm and stable, similar to the Holocene. Chemical analysis of ancient air bubbles trapped within Antarctic ice revealed that glacial periods had atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations of roughly 180 parts per million, much lower than the 280 parts per million which were present during the warm interglacial periods. Elemental studies of seafloor sediments have shown that the timing of changes in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and temperature have been tightly coupled to the timing of greater photosynthetic activity by single-celled protists called diatoms living in the southern oceans surrounding Antarctica during the Pleistocene. It's been shown that this enhanced photosynthesis by diatoms, which draws CO2 out of the atmosphere into the ocean and sequesters it in the deep ocean in organic matter, consequently removing CO2 from the atmosphere, could account for 40% of the change in atmospheric CO2 between glacial periods and interglacial periods during the Pleistocene. So, are these diatoms also a geologic terror? What about the 100-million-year-old coccolithophores whose shells make up the White Cliffs of Dover? What about the swamp plants of the Carboniferous era 300 million years ago that were buried, compacted, and heated to form coal? I found the discussion of the Earth as a sacred balanced system of fluxes pretty interesting because I'm a geochemist. My day-to-day job is reducing Earth processes to mass-balanced, steady-state systems of equations that are really simple to solve. So I think it'll be interesting to examine how earth sciences might view the transfer of the sublime of powerful nature to humankind. Earth system sciences would confine all human action within a narrow band of geologic history. Humans are decidedly inconsequential in comparison with processes like the differentiation of Earth into core, mantle, and crust, or the long, slow driving force of plate tectonics acting over billions of years. If the Anthropocene is defined by the imprint humans leave behind in the sedimentary archive, we have to think about what that imprint actually is. What will the robo-alien geologist 100 million years in the future see in Anthropocene sediments and deposits? Maybe high layers of lead and mercury, heavy metals, maybe the extinction of a bunch of different organisms, maybe evidence for a warmer climate. But there will be no imprint of humans' awareness of their actions left in the geologic record. Will be seen as a geological obscurity, less relevant to the Earth's evolution than diatoms.
Thanks.
So thanks again, Jean-Baptiste, for the lecture. Really got me thinking, and reading the paper did too. My comments at the start have a little overlap with Debbie's, I think, but so be it. At the start, you gave us a disclaimer that you didn't mean to argue that the discontinuities were less than weren't more than the continuities. But then the rest of the paper makes a case for the continuities in a sense. And so I guess I just wanted to explore the degree there. It does seem to me that that the Anthropocene, the term the Anthropocene, does capture something different in the last century, or maybe even last few decades, that we have affected the planet on a qualitatively different scale. And the idea is, as Frankie just said, is that our robo-alien, scientists from the future, long after we're gone, could come and look at the strata in this time, and anywhere in the world could see evidence of a sharp change from many, many different ways. And it's not only the climate change, but the chemical makeup, radioactive species that are in now here from the bomb test that you can measure in the soil, and species extinction. So I don't think that was true of the environmental changes in earlier centuries. Certainly not in Columbus's time, and so that's my first question, is whether you would agree with that or not. The other thing I wanted to explore is that the changes Columbus was talking about, right or wrong, and we could certainly, as Debbie did, argue about how good was the science then, but even if we accept them on the face of it, they were local changes. I mean, the forest here affects the rainfall here, and later there may have been global concerns generated, but it seems to me that those global changes, even if they were there, or even if some people believe they were there, were nothing but an agglomeration of local changes, as opposed to now where we emit greenhouse gases and they go everywhere and affect the climate everywhere. It seems to me different. And the other difference seems to me that deforestation is ultimately reversible. I mean, you can grow the forest back. You may not, it may take a long time to get back, all the native species of a rainforest, But I wonder if the same sense of irreversibility, I mean, you I think quite rightly pointed out the notion of the Anthropocene as a discontinuity, as a bifurcation where we can't go back. And was that idea present in the past considerations of climate change? The point you brought up that really resonated with me quite strongly, and I wanted to find a way to disagree with it, but I couldn't because I think it's right, is this notion of the Anthropocene as a not just as the sublime, but as an aesthetic criterion and one that induces a guilty pleasure. And I think the reason this resonated with me so much was that I study hurricanes as one of my research areas, and whenever there's a hurricane that's heading towards somewhere populated, like anyone else, I feel great concern for the people who are going to be hit by it. But as a scientist who studies hurricanes, I can't help but be fascinated and excited. And I think this is shared by people who study anything bad. I mean, if you study a doctor who studies epidemics, if they, when they see an Ebola outbreak, they've got to be horrified, but at the same time, if they're not excited on some level, they're not worth their salt as a scientist. And I think that's a tension that now, as we all are climate scientists a little bit, if we're reading the news, that we all feel this shock and awe, as you said it. And I don't know that this has to lead to hubris. I certainly don't think it has to lead to a belief in geoengineering. I think for many of us, it is a cause of great dismay, but as scientists and as others, considering this tremendous change that our planet's going through, if we were scientists from the future, we'd find it interesting. The fact that we're here now makes it even more so, and I think you're right that it's a guilty pleasure, and then we really have to struggle with that. But I guess I just want to close with the question, I mean, given the problematic nature, if those of us who are really engaged in trying to understand the Anthropocene and what the right responses to it should be, given the problems with the terms, what's a better one? And I would just like to leave it there. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for this.
Can we have everybody come up and then
There's already quite a lot on the plates.
Oh, yeah, no.
Then we can open.
Yeah, I just thought everybody could come up and then you could talk to each other. But, yeah.
No, I thought you were like other questions.
No. I realize that you need to respond to those very good questions.
Okay, so the issue about continuity and discontinuity. If the argument is to say that the knowledge at the time of Columbus is of a different character than current knowledge about climate change, the answer is of course yes. There are no satellite, there are no glacial evidence, and so on and so forth. This is of course, I mean, it's absolutely self-evident, and the knowledge infrastructure described by Paul Edwards is of course not there. At the same time, saying that what they are doing is not science and it's not knowledge would be extremely problematic for an historian, and probably just as anachronistic as saying that Christopher Columbus discovered climate change. At the time, it was the best science available. They couldn't do better. They had no other tools. I mean, and by studying the dates of harvest of grapes, I mean, they were doing pretty good work, actually. They were just inventing the method that we are using now. So we should be very careful about, again, having a condescending look towards this kind of knowledge. Once again, it was done by the Académie des Sciences. Joseph Banks at the Royal Society at one point explained that it would be a good idea to collect logbooks of whalers so as to study the evolution of the polar ice cap. Swiss geologists and Swiss foresters, actually, discovered the theory of the Ice Age in this context. It is because they were interested in climate change that they started to look with fresh eyes the glacial moraines. And it is in 1817 that a road engineer called Ignace Venetz explained that in the past, of course, the climate is changing for many reasons. Parts of them are human-induced, and deforestation was one of the explanations. But in the past, there used to be much larger glaciers. So it is a proof that, in a way, deforestation is perhaps not the crucial issue. So it is in this debate about climate change that very important knowledge about historical climatology and about climate emerged. So I really want to highlight the fact that this is not just like a kind of crazy theories by romantics. I mean, this is really serious and central institutions that are producing this knowledge about human-induced climate change. But once again, of course, I mean, I'm perfectly aware that our knowledge of climate change is of another order of magnitude, and I don't think that historicizing is just putting into doubt our current knowledge. On the contrary, I think we need to be really serious about that, about the importance of history and the social construction of facts, because our knowledge on climate change is just as historical as their knowledge of climate change. It's just embedded in history in the same way. And we should not draw strict boundaries between the kind of, dark past and enlightened present. I think it's a very, very important point. When I say they were living in the Anthropocene, of course, they knew they were kind of entering the Anthropocene. Of course, it's part provocation. But at the same time, one must realize that when the age of the Earth was still quite short at the end of the 18th century, Buffon established the age of the Earth at 70,000 years. Well, human history was kind of commensurable with the history of the Earth. So, for instance, the Swiss were studying the advance of glaciers. You know, what they were interested in was not so much the glaciers. Who cares about the glaciers? They were interested by the history of the Earth, and they were when in the 1810s, 1820s, they were seeing the glaciers advancing. Well, they were thinking they were living live in a way, the thermal death of the Earth. Because according to Buffon, the Earth is a kind of cooling star, a kind of piece of the sun, which is cooling down progressively. And so there is inexorably a kind of, death of the globe, a heat death of the globe. And the Swiss, the Swiss naturalists of Lausanne in particular were really interested in that. In the fact that they could study direct live, in a way, the evolution of the Earth, because there was not such a great separation between the age of the Earth and the human history. So, I mean, they were living in a kind of anthropocenic ontology, if you wish. And my argument is really at the ontological level. It's certainly not about, of course, the knowledge of climate change, which has radically changed in the last 50 years, and the functioning and the numerical simulation. I mean, it's all well known. It's really at the ontological level. I think the ontology of the Earth system, of the Earth as a system, as a machine in a way, is extremely old. And it is closely linked to natural theology and to the fact that the Earth is a creation. It's a divine creation. So, I mean, once again, there is a part provocation in this paper, but I think the crucial point is to restore the reflexivity of past societies in environmental issues. If you start writing environmental history by saying that, well, before they didn't know what they were doing, you write much less interesting environmental history than if you try to restore the categories of environmental reflexivity in which those people, those societies were thinking in. And natural theology, the idea that nature is organized in an economy that is an organized system, was really extremely important at the time. It was really the common knowledge and the common ideology of the intellectuals of the time. Okay.
So do the panelists want to respond or
I had a very small point about wood shortage. And of course, I mean, the wood shortage issue was, in a way, an argument for foresters to take control of communities, and especially in mountains. That's clear. At the same time, the issue of wood shortage is real. I mean, it's not either a machination, a Machiavellic way to control ignorant peasants, and not something they believed in. I think they believed in wood shortage. They believed in climate change. It was really it was not just a kind of a pretext for social control. And wood shortage is a very serious issue at the end of the 18th century. I mean, I've worked a lot on the Komodo inquests. These are public inquiry that are made before authorizing an industry to be established in a certain territory. And in these Komodo inquests, the issue of the reserves of wood and wood provision in a certain area is central and crucial. I mean, it's always raised. And for instance, for forges, I mean, to do iron, in some part of France, they could operate only 1 day in a week, not to consume too much wood. There were these kind of limitations. The issue about global, the fact that in the past it was local climate and now it is global, it's part true and it's also wrong. I mean, in the sense that it is very clear in the writings of Joseph Banks or in the writings of Roche, which I mentioned, or Rouget de la Bergerie or other French foresters, the issue was already global. I mean, it was really about global connection between what the forest you cut in North America has an impact. This has a climatic impact on what is happening in Northern Europe. I mean, this is perfectly clear in the text. The issue about irreversibility was also crucial for the environmental alert. I'm not saying they are right or wrong. I mean, I don't really care if they're right or wrong. I can tell you that I think they were wrong, but it's not very interesting for an historian to say that. The issue about irreversibility is very well expressed in this engraving. I mean, the idea is if you start cutting down forests, you change the climate, which prevents you from replanting forests afterwards. So you have an irreversible decline of the environment. And this has very dire consequences because at the time one has to remind that climate was much more important than now. Climate was the matrix of the shape of the human bodies, the matrix of, I mean, they were living in a transformist paradigm, Lamarck and so on, Buffon, that the idea that climate shaped very profoundly the living beings. So by altering the climate, you are altering your own race. And this, of course, that's a very strong racist argument saying that the Orientals, they have changed their climate and they created their own degeneration. Okay? So this is clearly reversible and very serious, I mean, at the time.
So let's, I'd like to give the panelists a chance to either respond very briefly or to restate your questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience before, yeah.
May I? Sure. So naturally, I'm not questioning whether there was a systematic means of producing knowledge in the past. I am a historian of science, and I believe that there is science in the past to study. My question is really about that jump from scientific theory to practical intervention. At what stage does research warrant a practical, say, a law that is going to directly impact people's lives and specifically prevent them from pursuing their economic opportunities? I think what you didn't bring up is the issue of quantification, because in answering that question, quantification is essential. If you need to adjudicate between competing interests and competing values, you need to be able to measure. And what was missing was numbers.
Yeah, let's let you, Adam, or Frank.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I'm still interested in your questions of the stratigraphy is going to look different in the future, and also what's a better term? What is a better aesthetic, actually? Okay, now I think we should open it up to the audience. I'm sure you have lots of questions. So please.
You started to allude to pursuing this through a different aesthetic. I'm not a political philosopher or anything. I don't know what these aesthetics mean, but I kind of got what you meant about Anthropocene being shock and awe. And essentially, my fear is that it essentially leads to a passivity because it becomes too big for any person to deal with, whether it's global population growth or economic globalization or the seeming extraction of resources from every far corner of the earth, including the Arctic now. So we basically are facing something that seems too big for any of us to handle. It requires collective action on a scale that we've never ever seen before. And so I think the Anthropocene is trying to capture some of that, but maybe failing to prompt any kind of realistic response, because apart from, maybe another narrative, in other words, or another aesthetic might get us there. So that's my question.
Let's take another question, and then we can answer a couple of them together. Right over here. Christina, could you hand it to the man? Oh, excuse me. Yeah, in the front row. There we go. The closest.
Thank you so much for the presentation, for the comments. I guess in general, the question that I have is what kind of question is Anthropocene? There's a lot of statements now of what it is, your counter-suggestion of what it could be instead, but what are the questions that we as humanists or scientists can engage with using the Anthropocene? Just taking as one example, you cited one paper by these 4 authors, of which at least one is an environmental historian. There's a collaboration of a magnitude which we have not seen in many years within humanities across to the sciences. So there's already a fair amount of work going on between the fields that did not exist before, and which Hauskulturen der Welt in Germany has been quite essential, at least for the working group in the Stratigraphic Council, to actually promote the term to begin with. So the term is not alien to humanists. Actually, humanists have been instrumental in creating the term to begin with. So the question that I'm posing to all of you, what are the new questions that we can have in Anthropocene as opposed to before?
So would anybody like to respond? Yeah, Adam.
No,
sorry.
somebody else.
Jean-Pierre?
Yeah. So about quantification. Sorry.
Try hard.
About quantification. Of course, this is a crucial point. Actually, the first tentative to measure climate change with thermometer is from the late 18th century. So it's Giuseppe Toaldo, an Italian astronomer in Padova. And he exploited 50 years of thermometric records and discovered, he's really an important guy, quite unknown in the history of science, but very important. He invented the tool of the écart la moyenne. Gosh, how would you say that in English? You average you average the temperature for 50 years, and then you calculate the difference each year to this average of 50 years. Okay, so he drew tables, a lot of tables. Enormous numerical work at the time without calculators, anyway. And he discovered that climate was getting much cooler. It was cooling really fast. In 50 years, 2 degree in 50 years, 2 degree warmer. This was not taken very seriously. This was thought to be too fast. Of course, Buffon's theory was connected to this measurement, but scientists at the time thought it was too rapid. And this tentative actually showed that thermometers were not reliable enough. You could not use old thermometers and old registers to do proper thermometric history. And so that is why they invented the method of the proxies in order to measure climate change without measurement. So they tried to, that's why they collected dates of harvest and so on and so forth. So the issue of quantification is, of course, crucial, and it was tried but didn't work. Regarding the other narrative question, I think this is a very important issue. And this is why the Anthropocene is interesting. It's such a bad word, and it's such a bad history about the environmental crisis. Population growth, economic growth. This is kind of common, boring, and not very interesting. It's the common narrative about the Anthropocene. The interest of the Anthropocene is that it could start serious research about, the real history of the environmental crisis, the real mess, the real history of the mess we are in. To be really serious about that. And it's what we have tried to do in a book with Christophe Bonneuil. And you have proposed other words and other stories. One is Anglocene. It looks a bit ridiculous, but in fact, it's Anglocene. It will be much more rigorous than the Anthropocene, at least until 1970, before the exponential rise of China. We also proposed, of course, Capitalocene, which is a very good contender to Anthropocene, but also Thanatocene, because war technologies are crucial in the history of the Anthropocene, in every respect. And the great acceleration that takes place in the 1950s, it's not by mistake, it's after World War II. And of course, World War II is crucial for the establishment of some of the crucial technological networks that are the root of the Anthropocene. If you take planes, for instance, planes nowadays, it's a complete inheritance of the Second World War. Aluminium, the jet engine, and then GPS, and so on and so forth. All these are war technologies. And war plays, and the military plays a crucial role in the Anthropocene for a very simple reason. It's because when the stake is to kill and not to be killed, the issue of energy efficiency is not crucial, which means that military technology has a kind of intrinsic tendency to energy wastefulness. I mean, a jet, a war jet, an F-16 consumes 7,000 liters of fuel per hour. Okay, so this is the equivalent of several years of normal use of a car. So I mean, really, and then of course, war technologies contaminate the civil world. So Thanatocene would be also a possible contender. Anyway, I think of course, the issue is not to give a name, but to give a proper history for the environmental crisis we're in. And I think we cannot be satisfied with the history of the philosopher either. Modernity, it's because we have separated nature and culture that we destroy the environment. It's really a very indiscriminate story. As if, reading Descartes, maître et possesseur de la nature, as if reading Robert Boyle, and as if doing experiments and separating nature and society was really the source of the environmental crisis. I mean, this is not very convincing either. So I think the main interest, and this is part of the answer to your question, the main interest of the word Anthropocene and its wide yet critical reception by social science and history is to really start and launch a serious history of the environmental crisis. One way to do this is, of course, quantification again. I mean, quantification, I think, is very important in this respect. And for us historians, I think the Anthropocene, and the fantastic curves that they present in one of the papers that have been made by Will Steffen, these curves that present like maybe 20 or 30 criteria, all these curves that describe the amount of the emissions emitted, the amount of phosphorus emitted, the amount of CO2, of course, all these massive quantities across the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, we don't have a proper history of that. Okay, so one of the key aspects I think for historical research is to quantify, history, to have a material quantification of history, in order to have a dialogue with the natural sciences. One way is to quantify the world system. It's the graph I show very quickly, about the fluxes of matter across the globe. I mean, I think this is very important research that is being done mainly in Vienna now, where they take custom statistics and they quantify the global flow of matter across the globe in the 20th century. And you have suddenly a much more materialized vision of the history of growth. It's not so much about innovation, innovators, and in a kind of Schumpeter way. It's really about matter.
So what you're proposing really is that the Anthropocene really generalizes and glazes over the history, and that what you're saying, or what you're calling for, is a much more granular history of the environment and of environmental science. And I guess, I mean, I'm assuming that you're saying that history will help, people, but also scientists, then find the causes of these things, the realistic causes of these things, and therefore to do something more about it. I mean, will spur people to action in a different way than Anthropocene, the shock and awe of Anthropocene will?
Yeah, it's part of if you have a kind of serious history of the Anthropocene, you can name people, you can name actors, you can name institutions, you can name countries, you can name companies, you have a serious history of that. Yes, I think it's more enabling, politically enabling, than saying this is the Anthropos or this is modernity, which is far too vague and not,
I, as a historian, I'm very sympathetic to that. I want to have the scientists, though, respond to that. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I guess this relates to the first point I brought up about the sort of qualitative difference in the stratigraphic evidence now versus several hundred years ago. I think the discussion tonight in the paper is mostly about the history of the idea of the Anthropocene. And I think it's useful at this historical moment in the United States, certainly, more than anywhere else, to separate the idea of the Anthropocene from the fact of the Anthropocene. In other words, we can argue about what people thought was happening in the past or what people think is happening today, what the causes for it are. I think the other words that you bring up, the Anglocene and all these, are ways of ascribing narratives or causes to the fact. But we're in a moment where I think the term serves as just another attempt to impress upon people the reality of what's happening, which many people, including our currently newly elected government, just don't want to believe. And so that's the context in which we have to think about this. There's a strain of thought. These ideas may have been there in the past that humans could change the climate or change the Earth on a global scale, but they weren't common, right? I mean, they weren't in the same way that they need to be now, and among the whole population of the planet. And so I think the term serves to communicate to people that we're not just people living on a planet and we can assume it'll always be there and it'll be fine whatever we do, because that's a narrative that we have to face still, And so the term may or may not be the perfect one to capture all the reasons and the causes, but it's just another way, it's one more attempt to put into a simple message in a simple term the fact that what we've done now and what we are doing is qualitatively different than anything before, and we can't just take the planet for granted. So it doesn't capture all the causes and all that, except that it is human beings. I mean, it may be a subset of human beings doing a certain subset of things, but it's still human beings. And if we look at the history of stratigraphy, where it's marked by fossils and stuff, I mean, we're a species like any other species at the end of the day, so it captures that. So I guess that's all. I just want to draw that distinction between the sort of scientific fact of it and the idea.
I would also just push towards the idea that the Anthropocene is about more than just the climate as well. There's more geologic actions being taken or being recorded by humans than just the emissions of CO2. You're fundamentally changing the way that the water cycle works, for instance. Leaded gasoline, I think that's one of the most diagnostic markers of the Anthropocene, actually, is lead sticks around essentially forever geologically. And emissions of, lead have gone into the ocean. You can measure them everywhere in the ocean, and they're only going to end up in the sediments. And that'll be one, super distinct marker of human activity. But, pollution is one huge thing. Contamination by radioactive substances is another. Just changing the geomorphology of the Earth, just fundamentally changing the landscape. These are all sort of major parts, I think, of the Anthropocene that can be ascribed beyond just the sort of CO2 carbon cycle part of it.
Yeah, I found it so interesting that you said this, this separates humans from nature, but I really see it as a term which shows which demonstrates to the public, or at least suggests to the public, to the larger world outside of science and academia, that humans and nature are completely balanced with one another. And I don't know, maybe that's because in the United States the public discourse doesn't really reflect that, or at least we have very strong political, factions that don't reflect that. I mean, what about the other panelists? I'm curious whether the term Anthropocene,
I think Frankie was making the point that we're actually not the first species to change the conditions for life on Earth. So Anthropocene really does highlight the distinctiveness of man in a way that I agree is immodest and leads us to expect that we will solve whatever problem we've gotten ourselves into. I really like the question about what new questions does Anthropocene allow us to ask, and I'm also really sympathetic to Jean-Baptiste's call to write a history of how we knowingly entered the Anthropocene. I would just tweet that to say that we really need some nuance. We need to study the phenomenon of knowing and not knowing that has characterized the history of industrialization and the rise of ecology simultaneously, often hand in hand, right? And this is, I don't know, I see it as kind of a history of consciousness, a way of historicizing some of the conclusions that cognitive psychologists are coming to about our incapacity to perceive or imagine human, effects across vast scales of space and time, we need to think historically about those capacities.
More questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah.
I was hoping you were going to respond to Debbie's point.
Yeah, again, the issue about the history of knowledge and non-knowledge, I think this is a crucial point, but it won't be a history of the rising awareness. It's not necessarily the history of a growing awareness of better knowledge. It can be the contrary. And for what happened during the industrialization, this is clearly the case. I mean, at the end of the 18th century, the fashionable thing in medicine was to study the environment. Doctors were doing what is called medical topographies. They would describe the places very accurately and correlate that to longevity, to mortality statistics. And they'd explain that industrial fumes, of course, was reducing the quality of life, was creating illnesses, even epidemics. Okay? And this was common, to take your word. This was the common knowledge of the people. I mean, you've got in the archives, you've got petitions against artisans or industrialists, which are signed by hundreds of people of every social background, mobilizing the argument of neo-Hippocratic medicine, of environmental medicine of the time. And what happened in the 1820s and 1830s is that this environmental medicine was marginalized, first by a more social vision of the health. It was Louis-René Villermé, a very important French hygienist, who explained that mortality was better correlated to wealth than to the environment. So, of course, this created a very convenient argument for the government, which was authorizing en masse new industries, saying that, well, the Industrial Revolution industry might be stinky, it might stink, but it creates more wealth and therefore population in better health. Okay? So the history of knowledge and non-knowledge might not be a kind of happy history towards the IPCC. I mean, it might be a much more complex history, and the election of Donald Trump is, of course, a perfect example of that. I mean, about the fact that non-knowledge might prevail. I mean, we should not take for granted that, Adam Zobel will win. I mean, it's not for sure. I mean, it might be that actually the great period of, knowledge about climate might come to an end in a way. So the story that I propose of, the creation of ignorance, which is a very important theme now in history of science, like agnotology, but also the creation of disinhibition, might help us, to tackle some of the current issues about climato-skepticism. Skepticism.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Right. I mean, so I think coming out of that, one of the really interesting questions is about how scientific knowledge is taken up by by non-scientists. So, for instance, you quoted Stefan comparing the Anthropocene as a concept to Darwinism, and how I didn't understand actually what the implications of that were, because obviously Darwinism has had so many different interpretations with such different political consequences. Is the Anthropocene that open to interpretation, and what do we do with that if it is? So I think this is another area for both historical and present-day kind of sociological studies. What do people do with scientific knowledge? How do they work it into their cosmologies, their theories of the sacred earth or the wealth creation or whatever it is that they see the resonance with?
I'd be interested to hear what Frankie and Adam have to say to that. Do you think about how the scientific knowledge that you're producing is being received?
Every day. How can you not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's being received badly at the moment, but...
But do you think about ways such as, sociology to understand why it is that it's not received, actually.
Or do you come up against specific examples
Yeah.
of how you find people to be understanding it differently than you understand it?
No, I'm not that, it's not that deep. I think that they're powerful groups of people who just don't want it to be understood, and that's the problem we're up against. It's a street fight, it's not, it's not that.
That historicizing it won't help.
Not in practical terms, I don't think, but it's a good idea to do anyway, unless it makes us think of something, some different way of approaching the problem in the real world. I wanted to say something, though, about your point about the issue of whether the term, and I think this is maybe not unrelated to this question, although it's a little bit to the side, perhaps, about how the term brings humans and nature together rather than putting them apart. I mean, on the face of it, it does bring them together, right? Because anthropo means humans, and scene is, I don't know the etymology, but it's a term having something to do with time, but it's used only in the scientific. I mean, it's only paleontologists and stratigraphers and the like who use it. So it clearly is talking about the Earth and people in one word. And I think, the things it makes me think about, just to go back to this theme of getting people to understand that that we're acting on this massive scale, and there's no, and that it's different than we weren't sort of taught that as children. The writer, novelist Amitav Ghosh has a new book now about climate change history and culture, where he talks about novels and why there's no serious novels about climate change. We could debate whether that's true or not and clarify and all that, but as he defines serious novels, it's true. And even his own novels, and he's very obsessed with climate change, but he doesn't write about it. And his argument, as I understand it, is basically that that the novel, as it's existed for hundreds of years, is sort of defined itself to be about sort of the internal lives of people. I mean, on a very small scale in their immediate human circumstances, and that the great forces of nature, which were there in biblical epics, Gilgamesh and stuff, and the gods, but those are out, and they would be seen in a novel as sort of hacky deus ex machina if you brought them in. Somewhere in the plot, somebody's hit by a bolt of lightning or a tornado, or he actually uses the example of tornado. It would be seen as really bad writing or something, bad novel. And the other one is this historian at Chicago whose name is escaping me, who wrote the big thing about.
Frederick Johnson?
No. Indian fellow. What's his name? Anyway, the argument is that in the past there was human history and natural history, and they're in sort of different departments in the university.
Dipesh Chakrabarti, I think.
Thank you, Chakrabarti. Yeah. But now all history isn't going to be natural history. I mean, these are the kind of things that the Anthropocene says to me. That there are this sort of human sphere and there's the planet sphere, and we are taught in many, many ways culturally to think of them as different things, and they're really not anymore. That's what so I mean, to me, that concept is bigger than we have to accept that first before we can start ascribing agency in a more, historical way. So I don't know that. Maybe I changed the topic. I'm not sure.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I have more of a comment than a question, but this is going back to the question of knowledge, and in a way speaks to the Ghosh book a little. Your talk for me, I was very struck by how many islands are in your story, and to me, when I think about environmental thought and French colonial islands, for example, I think of the local knowledge that was playing a profound role in recognizing something called soil erosion or deforestation. So for me, I see your story carving out a real place for the local, the embodied experience, the relatively longue durée experience of living in a single place. That to me seems to also have some kind of power in this Anthropocene conversation that is outside the discourse of science writ large, but is something, it seems to me, I'm never overly optimistic about these things, but it seems to carve out a place for something like Eskimo pointing out that the entire hunting season has changed, has collapsed in ways they've never seen before in their 80 years of living there, whatever. Or it gives weight to a woman in Kansas saying her family is experiencing far more frequent earthquakes. So I just want to put that on the table as other forms of knowledge that can have weight in this conversation.
Anybody want to respond from the panel? Yeah, right here.
I mean, so I think, Leah, that's a fabulous point. I think what you're raising here is that actually in any one time and place, there are multiple standards of evidence and of inference, and that this is something that we as historians need to pay close attention to. And it makes it all the more difficult to say when humanity is acting knowingly.
No, I mean, the issue about local knowledge and personal knowledge, I mean, of course, I should have said that in the talk. I mean, this was actually the main knowledge that experts try to collect. I mean, because thermometry was not so clear, they try to collect narratives, individual narratives of this mountaineer who could cross this pass and now cannot because it is too cold. This kind of crop that could grow in this farm and now it's not possible. It is this kind of very local and personal knowledge that was at the root of climatic knowledge in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, I should have said that. I mean, you're entirely right. That's the crucial point. I just wanted to come back to this supposedly separation between human history and history of the Earth. I mean, Deepesh Chakrabarty's article is very important, but I think if you look at historians of the 18th century, they write one history, a natural history and a human history, and it is meshed together. I mean, if you read Gibbon, if you read Pelletier, if you read Ignace Arts, and historians of the late 18th century write history of people, like history of the Celts, history of the Germans. I mean, they write a climatic history. Because when the population expands, when there is population growth, they cut down forests, they improve the climate, and these trigger a civilizing loop. There is this idea that by growing population, the climate is better, so you don't need warriors and you have farmers in a way. So this is really the narrative of modernity is a narrative where natural history and human history is completely meshed together. So this idea that there was a great separation in the modern mind, and now with Anthropocene at last, we put it together thanks to this fantastic word. I mean, first, it's very pompier, but anyway. And second, this is false. I mean, simply false. It does not fit the record, okay, the history of historiography.
I had something to add to your question. I think it's interesting to consider how the Anthropocene, or generally climate change, actually modifies the production of local knowledge. So, you mentioned the Eskimos as, saying that the hunting season has changed, and that's their form of local knowledge. And, my form of local knowledge that's the equivalent of that is knowing which subway to take to Trader Joe's. And just the fact that I live in, an extraordinarily, anthropocentric environment in New York City, for instance, as opposed to the Yukon or in Alaska, says something very different about, how I produce local knowledge versus how an Eskimo might produce local knowledge. And as climate change sort of dictates that there will be mass migration of people between different areas and between differently sort of anthropocentric versus natural areas, there might be a vast change in the way that local knowledge is produced and what kind of local knowledge is produced.
I mean, on this issue of the separation of natural and human history, so I don't know the history you describe, but would you really argue that tradition is continuous up to today? I mean, if you go and walk into any university in the United States, certainly this one, I mean, clearly that separation is quite sharp. It's changing a little bit now. We have a few historians like yourselves who are, it is changing. Whether that's a response to Anthropocene, I think it somewhat is. I mean, not to the word, but to the, to the reality. So I mean, the precedent may be there, but don't you think that that something has changed now?
Oh yes, it has, but it took place much later than commonly believed. I think it took place late in the 19th century. It didn't take place in the 1820s, 1850s, but very late in the 19th century when, it should be another talk actually, but when several disciplines were created against climate theory. If you take sociology, for instance, it was clearly created and invented against Montesquieu's model of sociology, of climate theory. Montesquieu? Right. Auguste Comte coined the word sociology to explain that what invented the law of the three states is a kind of inherent tendency in the history of humankind, and that climate is just a kind of marginal factor influencing this tendency, but it is not central. Okay? If you take economics, in the same way, if you take early 19th century economics, climate is everywhere. Of course, I mean, with physiocracy and then with the law of marginal returns of Ricardo, agriculture is, of course, the first economic sector at the time. Agriculture being climate dependent, climate was central for economics and political economy in the classic tradition. And with marginalism, with neoclassic and Stanley-Jevons theory of utility, then climate starts to be much less important because what is important becomes a kind of, psychological state, the utility that individuals attribute to goods, okay? You could do the same argument with history, and I think here the theory of glaciations is very important because you've got a different vision of human history where humanity is caught and trapped in vast climatic cycles on which it has no grasp, okay? So you're right, I mean, this separation took place, but much later. And actually in the US, the tradition of writing together human and climate history continues much later. You've got, I cannot pronounce his name, Eliworth Huntington, who is a very good example of that. And it is, I think, really late, I mean, in the 19th century that you can argue that a separation took place.
So, I mean, I would agree with that, except that I would say that those histories of human and nature written together were histories of the human conquest of nature, whether they were in the 18th century mode of the rise of civilization or the 19th century mode of nationalist histories. That was always the narrative. And so we are doing something different today in that respect.
I'd agree with that, yeah.
I would love if people are interested to come back also to this question of the value of local and embodied knowledge historically and today, because I wonder whether there's a sense in which the history of the Anthropocene is sort of synonymous, maybe necessarily, with the devaluation of knowledge tied to personal experience. I mean, in order to produce global evidence, we have to kind of deracinate knowledge. And so I wonder how we should think about those two imperatives. On the one hand, if people are going to believe it, they need to feel it, right? On the other hand, if we're going to present it as evidence by the standards of today, it can't just be subjective. So.
I will tell you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, Adam, please. Yeah.
I mean, on a more mundane level, what you describe is evident to me in the day-to-day efforts of scientific laboratories to market their own work. So, I talk a lot to the media people here, and it's a little hard. I mean, what many of us do in climate science is pretty unexciting day to day because of exactly what you say. The data comes from all over the world. We put it into computer models. We sit there at the table, and it doesn't look exciting. And so when our media people want to find something to make a story about and put it up on the webpage or whatever, they really like field work. They like somebody to be out there in the ocean, on the ice, on the top of a mountain, whatever. That's what they like. And they come, they kind of like me because I write about extreme weather events, and the people always like that. But basically, for those of us who are climate modelers, I mean, of course, it has it's globally important, and so they do promote what we do. But it's tougher for them to write stories about us because they always say, give us a picture. And it's like, well, we can take a satellite picture. It's kind of hackneyed, but we got lots of those. Or we can, take a picture of some place where something, some place that's evocative or something. But there's no, because the work that those of us who really work at the global scale is exactly, deracinated is not the word I would have thought of, but maybe that's a word for it. It's taken out of its local context. It doesn't make for nice visual stories, and that's something that is apparent when we try to communicate to the public.
Yeah, a comment.
I think there's a way to. I think the first step is really. Sorry. I mean, there's a series this week in the New York Times. It seems that's all about the human impact of climate change. So a story about West Africans fleeing Mali and trying to, but that's, what if the New York Times had a weekly section on climate change? Or there's, but in the human way. I think there are ways to really draw those connections out. That's not at all discounting the slower work of science, but rather putting it in this matrix.
Yeah, that does sell. I mean, the climate impacts at the local scale, but that's different than the underlying science of global climate itself. They're related, but they're different. I mean, the scientific research going into those stories would be different scientific research.
Beside you.
Yeah, I'll try to make this a question too. There's an environmental historian called Joachim Radko, who at some point paraphrased John Lennon from the song "Life is what happens when you're making other plans," and he made it into a methodological statement that environment is what you create when you are doing other things. So what are the other processes right now that you see which are, so to speak, anthropocenic or could be described as such? But by the groups themselves, in their own knowledge, would not be described as Anthropocene. They might never come across that term. Other processes that are altering in the world that that is caused by climate change, but people would assert blame in other places. Conflicts which do not have climate as the epithet, so to speak.
Well, I was interested to hear that Syria was being explained in terms of climate change. And, I would wonder actually it's kind of the opposite of what you meant, the inversion of what you meant. But, that seems to me to be a growing awareness. Now, it may be completely historically mistaken, but, and it may in fact be the kind of, glossing over that is can be extremely problematic in thinking about political events and the causes of political events.
I mean, that research was done here that you're talking about, and I not by me, but I know the people who did it. And if I could try to say what I think they would say, they wouldn't say that climate change caused the war. They would say that one of the causes of the war was a famine, and one of the causes of the famine was a drought, and one of the causes of the drought was climate change.
That's fair. I heard it fifth hand, so.
I mean, those are the kind of attribution statements we can make in climate science. They're always unsatisfying that way, because any big thing that happens always has lots of causes. I'm sure this is a problem historians understand very well. And, at most we can we can find one of them. But that's how I think that they've said it.
But that speaks to sort of, how the information propagates, right? It starts off with climate change caused a famine, caused part of the Syrian conflict, and it ends up in the end with climate change caused the Syrian conflict.
But it does show an awareness coming into the public, which may seem strange to somebody from Paris, but it's not strange to somebody from the United States.
I should say that this is this very problem is a big part of the public communication problem, because what makes people, we're told over and over again that what convinces people the most is extreme events. There's a big disaster, people understand that, and so there's a big effort to it's called extreme event attribution. I was actually on National Academy panel this last year that wrote a report about this. It's something we used to say we couldn't do. You can't attribute one event to climate change, but now we sort of do it. Although in the way that I just described, the responsible studies say, well, there's always lots of causes, but the odds were changed by this much, and so you can. And that's a very unsatisfying argument. You know, and there's a counter argument made that we shouldn't be emphasizing extreme events precisely because these attribution statements are so hedgy and so unsatisfying if they're done responsibly that in a sense we're presenting the science on its weakest foot. You know, what we can say most surely is the global temperature went up this much and it's because of carbon dioxide, but nobody cares about the global temperature. So we're asked to say something about a hurricane, but we're not very good at that. So the argument is we should talk about the hurricane because it gets people excited, but we shouldn't because we can only make weak, fuzzy statements. So this is I don't know anymore how this relates to the Anthropocene, but it's but it relates to the connection between history and climate science, because now we're really being asked to make concrete historical, causal statements in order to make our pitch to the world, and it's tough. It's really tough.
I'm just curious whether, from a scientific or historical point of view, people find value in those kinds of studies and trying to know
the issue
what
about
the environmental determinants were.
The issue about climate in Syria came out in French newspaper, and I found it quite obscene in a way. I mean, seeing climate guys trying to capture a kind of civil war conflict, which is really caused by Bashar al-Assad bombing civilian populations, and relating that to their research seemed to me extremely grossier. Sorry?
Absurd and in poor taste.
Obscene, I don't know if it would be, but no, I was really kind of shocked by this. And there's so much, when you read about historical climatology, about the Little Ice Age and the cause of civil war in Britain or the Fronde in France. I mean, there's tons, books, libraries written on these kind of topics and debates, counter debates. It's extremely difficult to make this kind of causal argument between climate and a political phenomenon. And I think we should be very careful not to jump to easy conclusions, even if it's for the good cause. I mean, it seems to me extremely
So how are those kinds of studies different from the historical quantification that you were calling for, the attribution of responsibility to certain companies for certain environmental disasters? What's the difference epistemologically between one
first,
and the other?
I think we are not writing history to convince people that there is climate change. I mean, I think this is really not the right question to ask. And first of all, it's like improving the historiography. I mean, I think Anthropocene, because there is matter, which is put on the front of the issue, and quantification of matter, is a kind of stimulus for Earth historians, because we've got a lot to learn from Earth science, to try to materialize our narratives, to have a more materialized vision of economic growth in the 20th century. That history of tech is not about innovation. Or it's not only about innovation. I mean, nowadays, history of tech, it's about, in a Schumpeter way, it's about the innovation and the growth of productivity. No, I mean, the history of growth is also a material history of flows of matter that provision the core countries of the world system, and we need to have that on the paper. We need to just to write that properly. So it's my point. I mean. I think the Anthropocene has this important effect for historians. I'm not saying that it will convince anyone to stop using their cars. I mean, it's not the issue. But I think it's important for history to have a better history. That's it.
So how would climate scientists work with a historian who was trying to write this more materialized narrative? I mean, what kind of empirical data would be useful to that historian?
Not necessarily their data. I mean, what we need is data, for instance, from the customs administration. I mean, what is the, for instance, what is the role of the military in our atmosphere? What is the role of World War II in the climate crisis? It is these kind of issues that we don't have any answer. I mean, if we all have in mind this, this incredible curve of CO2 emissions growing in the 20th century, we don't have a proper history of it. We cannot put some historical concepts, like Fordism or imperialism or unequal exchange or industrial revolution behind this curve. I mean, we don't have the proper quantitative work to do that. What is for instance, the respective impact of, I don't know, cars versus industrial agriculture in the climate change? It's not obvious. I mean, we don't really have it's not only historians, it's statisticians, and
But is that a question that a climate scientist, or, I don't know, climate scientist is probably the wrong, but could approach?
Well, I mean,
the relative.
I don't know if this is addressing what you mean, but I mean, if you want to, in terms of the actual number of gigatons of carbon from agriculture versus cars, I mean, somewhere in the IPCC report, I'm sure there's a pie chart that says that it might be not that accurate. It may not be what you're asking.
It's not historical, but it's very...
Fair enough.
I mean,
yeah, okay, but
right. It's still...
So you're asking something else, and
It's about processes more than, right now, there is this amount of course, we know that agriculture is 25% of CO2 emissions, transport is around 20. I mean, we have this fact, but what we need is a narrative, once again. I mean, a history, not just a statistics, but science.
Constructing a continuous curve from discrete events.
yeah.
I want to give the last word to the patient audience member in the back row. Do you have a microphone?
Oh boy, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I was wondering then specifically, because it's been alluded to several times, about this sort of nature-culture divide, and particularly I'm interested in hearing what the scientists think about this, because it sounds like what I'm hearing is sort of this idea that the problem of the Anthropocene creates the possibility of collapsing this nature-culture distinction, and we are essentially left with one history as opposed to two distinct histories. So in that respect, I'm curious because it also seems like this kind of discourse around human planetary impact comes at the exact same moment that any kind of possibility, socially, politically, historically, whatever, of a different world seems to just be sort of taken off the table. So there's sort of this growing notion of human impact, but at the same time, sort of trivializing of human agency. So I guess I'm wondering about the interaction between those two, and then specifically how, again, particularly for the scientists, you conceive of your ability to sort of use then this natural historical narrative to sort of mobilize a kind of cultural narrative, which is to say a politics around this, because something that I also notice is when I hear people talking about this, 9 times out of 10, the things that they're talking about, we sort of alluded to in the initial presentation, this idea of the Capitalocene as opposed to the Anthropocene, and as you pointed out, for many people, it's far more conceivable to think of the Earth system collapsing than thinking about not having capitalism. So it's just, I guess this is an observation to tack onto that, is just that I noticed that particularly when we talk about the kinds of things that could be done or how we're going to, how do we get people to understand the scale of the problem, the things that I hear tend to be fundamentally the exact same kind of politics that we've been dealing with for quite a while, particularly since the end of the Cold War. So I guess the question itself is about the collapse of historical agency with the rise of planetary impact of humans.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I didn't get the question.
How we get to an answer to that question. I mean, there's a.
I mean, part of my talk is written. The point was to say that the issue is not about the fact that we separated nature and culture in the past, because this is false. We didn't do that. Okay. Nevertheless, we did enter in the Anthropocene. So part of the talk is actually a kind of plea to get rid of this idea of a great divide between nature and culture, which has obsessed so much the philosophers, because it's not that important. It's a very idealistic vision of the history of the environmental crisis, and we need a much more material one. But I mean, the answer would be that it's not such a, perhaps not a good entry point for the Anthropocene, this idea of there was a separation, now it is bridged. I think it's not very interesting.
David, I heard you to be asking about human agency and how we think about human agency in the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I mean, I think he was really interested in how scientists are thinking
Right,
about
yeah.
human agency today.
So can you rephrase the question?
Me?
In a way that a scientist
Somebody?
would understand.
I don't understand the question.
Can you just clarify the concept of like what exactly you mean that human agency is like incredibly broad? Can you like, I don't know, narrow that down a little bit?
What I mean is that geopolitically, at this point, liberalism won, right? So at this point in human history, there is no alternative, right? It's basically we have capitalism, we have liberal governance, and that's it. There is no international workers' movement. There is no international idea that anything could possibly be different. And then when we're talking about places like China, right? You're talking about essentially command economies transitioning more into market economies, but fundamentally doing the same thing.
So what's
I'm
the
not going to
question?
repeat that. Sorry.
I mean,
How
I understand the statement now,
How
but
would a
what's the...
scientist think of, I mean, what is the response to that? This is not a challenge, but rather, in
Where
terms
do
of
we
the
look for a
political
solution?
mobilization. Yeah.
Yeah.
Scientists are uniquely unqualified to answer that.
But, I mean,
Well, I mean, are you addressing yourselves to individual citizens? Or are you addressing yourselves to cities, municipal governments, to national governments, to international agencies?
Most of us aren't addressing ourselves to anyone but our peers. I mean, I think to the extent that climate science, and maybe any science, I don't know, but certainly speaking for climate science, interacts with the larger world, it's historically been through I think it's been in a very idealistic and naive way. I mean, we write our papers, then we say, okay, let's get together and put all the papers together into an IPCC report, and then we'll put out policy recommendations, which are written in a way that, I mean, the IPCC is a UN activity, but it's sort of the whole idea, and it's certainly expressed when you read, scientific grant proposals that try to make any appeal to usefulness or policy or something in the introduction before going on to say they're going to do some very technical thing. There's a sort of naive idea that we're going to do our science and we're going to tell the world, and then some benign world government is going to listen to us and, do the logical thing. There's no, discussion of capitalism or any of this. I mean, I shouldn't say there's none. There may be somewhere, if you read the IPCC report carefully. Certainly there's an implicit acknowledgement of how the world works. I mean, we're not clueless, but I don't think that scientists are particularly good at understanding the institutions to which the science is being fed. I mean, there may be representatives who are, there may be individual scientists who go and work in government and, figure out how to work the system, but the regular people in the trenches, I think by and large we have no clue.
Well, it's not your realm of explanation and understanding. I mean,
I guess that's a short way of what I'm saying.
and that's does speak to a separation, which is actually impacting us. I mean, in reality.
I think a bit of a counterpoint to that is the example of NASA, or I'm sorry, not just NASA, but like space planetary sciences. And they have super great visuals of what they're talking about all the time that tell their story for them. And we oftentimes don't do that, or don't have that, right?
Well,
our ability to sort of get our point across to different groups is often impeded by our sort of ability to just speak a language other than like dictational science.
Right, but I would describe that's more of a PR thing. I mean, we may be
funding. Yeah.
PR, I mean, we may be good at PR sometimes, but I think the question was about, was not about. I mean, you can do PR no matter who your audience is. No matter what you're trying to achieve, you're just trying to say what I'm doing is important, right? That's what NASA's doing when they're trying to excite people. But I mean. That's making a case for science itself in some sense. But I think the question was about how do we think about how the information is used in the world with the institutions that it has and capitalism and liberal governance. And I mean, we are trained to put that out of our minds. I mean, we're trained in this sort of monkish, practice where we are supposed to exclude that from our thinking, and then later someday we grow up and we have to face that we're in the world, and I think we're pretty clueless.
I mean, I think that most academics actually are. I mean, they are trained to exclude that. I don't know. Do you think that you historians think that that's true of historians also, of most historians?
It's certainly not the reward system, right? We're not rewarded for the fact that our knowledge is taken up and put to use in the world.
That's true.
I mean, I think the point you had is very important. Basically, your point was very important. I mean, the success of the Anthropocene is reflects the fact that there is no alternative, and that the scientists came up with this word Anthropocene, mistaking humans for a very, very small subset of humanity, which is, of course, the Western industrialized countries. Is a perfect reflect the current ideological situation.
On that note, I think we have to call it an evening. We've actually gone overtime, and there's this wonderful, beautiful reception that is waiting for us all. But I want, before we go to it, to thank Jean-Baptiste for a really very, very stimulating lecture, and to all of our panelists for really engaging. I mean, I really feel like this shows how we should, as scientists and humanists or social scientists, be talking to each other and trying to figure out what is our common language and what is our common aim. So thank you all very much for your engagement.